Welcome to Running the Show, a podcast exploring the intersection of running and business. The wait's over, everybody. Sprint has arrived on July 2nd. Sprint was released on Netflix. This is the docu-series that we have been anticipating so readily this year, and I'm happy to report that we're going to be producing a little bit more conversation on it now that we have something to go off of. We've speculated about the storylines, the people, the conflicts, everything that'll make this production worth it and exciting and something that will help the sport as a whole. And we're going to do an episode by episode analysis of this particular series. And we'll do some things after as well as we get closer to the Olympics. But in this first episode of our analysis, of our episode companion, we are so happy to be joined by Laura Thweatt. She's been a guest on the podcast before, a longtime friend and favorite. She brings in this expertise from the racing side on the global scale, and she has seen the industry change over 20 years. So I'm really fortunate for her lending that perspective as we both watch this show for the first time. And we're going to be new and novice to this as well. So please provide your thoughts, your emphatic opinions of what we should expect, what we should focus on, and please enjoy. Welcome back to Running the Show. This is after a brief hiatus, we are back with quite an occasion here. Not only are we welcoming Laura Thweatt back to the podcast, but we're here to chat about an idea that we planted several weeks ago, probably a few months ago at this point, of chatting episode by episode when Sprint, the Netflix docuseries, actually comes out. Laura, welcome back.
Thank you. It's good to be back. And yes, we planted this seed months ago when we did our first recording kind of on the topic when we knew this was coming out. I don't even think then we knew exactly when it was coming out, but we had our guesses it would be this summer, most likely as a lead up to the games. And then, we kind of did a hypothetical of what that would look like, questions that you would have if Netflix came to you as an athlete and was this is the series we want to do, and how all of that would unfold. So, but now we have it, Sprint, out on Netflix. It was Drew texted me when it came out and he was happy Sprint Day for all who celebrate. It's this was something we've been counting down for so long. So now we're here to talk about it, and I'm pumped because I'm an episode in and it's good. It pulled me in pretty quickly.
Yeah. And I know that I'm pumped to talk about this and talk about it in a more long form format, because I know my normal viewing techniques here when I see something on Netflix, especially something I like, is to binge it, just kind of go from one episode to the next. So this is an exercise in restraint for me, personally. And
right.
And hopefully it'll be a moment, I'd love to put these out weekly, going episode by episode and sharing some thoughts, maybe referring back to conversations that we've had and matching storylines that we expected would come about, and then also talk about some interesting nuances that come up in each episode, worth noting here. But yeah, obviously open to any avenue it goes. But I did want to make sure for anyone who has been living under a rock and doesn't know who Laura is, I will let Laura you can intro yourself. But the thing that I can say, in addition to the podcasting prowess that you have, I mean, you are in the midst of a storied distance career, not quite a sprint career, but you have track experience, road experience, anything from, you have a lot of range, and that extends to the career that you have right now, and from a time perspective, but also the events that you do. So I love the perspective that you bring to the table of seeing running capital R through several different perspectives, and you've seen things change a lot. So that's why I appreciate you being here today. For sure.
Yeah, no, I've been in the sport a long time, almost 20 years. I think actually more than that now, which is crazy. So yeah, I've seen it change and kind of move and transition into where we are now, and the space we're in now is just unbelievable from like every event. Like, I mean, coming off the Olympic trials and everything we saw from field to track, from sprints to distance. I mean, the depths of American distance running and then like the depths of track and field just globally is on a whole nother level. So I think that's what makes the timing of sprint so much fun is one, we're going into the games. We're just hot off, like as far as from the US standpoint, we're hot off the trials. And so I've always been a big proponent. Like I've always really enjoyed backstories on athletes. And I really think that that's kind of like the job of the media is to give athletes platforms to share their stories and their journeys. And once I know a backstory on an athlete and I have like a better sense of their journey and how they got to where they have gotten, and especially like the level they've gotten themselves to when it comes to making teams, I will root for them unconditionally. And so sprint is really cool because as you said, I'm more of a distance girly. So I'm not as like familiar or in the sprint scene, but obviously I've watched track and field since I was in high school. And like the 100, 200, like those are just like the big events that I think no matter who you are, whether you're in the sport or not, like you're drawn to those events, like especially at the Olympics or like world championships. And so this documentary is really cool for me because it's giving me like an inside look into what those events are like. And I'm getting to learn the athletes in those events in a different way than I think I've ever really been able to before. So that's what's been really cool for me. And like jumping into that, like I didn't know hardly anything about Marcel Jacobs. And now I'm just like again, I'm only an episode in, but I'm like big fan. Yeah. Would love to see him like triumph. Would love to see him come back. But like I didn't really know anything about him other than that he won the Olympics 3 years ago. And so that's kind of what this documentary is doing is it's giving us like this inside look into the lives of some of the biggest sprinters in the world. So that's been really cool for me.
Yeah. I know I'm going to ask some questions and kind of drawing parallels to your experience in the professional racing space to see, you know, what is talked about in the show and how that kind of correlates with your expertise in racing. But just kind of setting the table and how Sprint episode 1 opens up, right? We have this theme set called Heir to the Throne, right? It's like everyone's leading with messages of just establishing the big names in the sport. This is the commonality of this box-to-box production agency. They did it with Tour de France Unchained, which recently came out with their newest series, season 2, but all of the other things that they do as well. You know, the who's who of it, but then also setting the personalities, the conflicts, the pinnacle, and making you know in that first maybe even like 3 to 5 minutes why we're here and how everything kind of pieces together on the puzzle. So, right, when you're looking at the personalities they're establishing here, Laura, right, we saw Noah Lyles, Sha'Carri, Shelly-Ann Fraser-Price, Sharika Jackson, Zarno Hughes, right? So many folks that we saw. Was there anyone that you were maybe surprised to see like in the scope of these personalities introduced from the athlete side, or someone that you think they're leading out right now and they might bring in later?
Yeah, I mean, I thought like the intro, like kind of before they even jumped into the episode, like it hit on all like the big global names. I am interested to see how, like, if they incorporate more US sprinters. Like, obviously, they're going to really focus on Noah. They're really going to focus on Sha'Carri. They have Gabby Thomas, which I was glad to see her in there. I'm a huge Gabby Thomas fan, so I'm hoping to have a little bit more insight into, like, who she is, and a little bit more of her story and, like, just her journey in the sport. But yeah, like, I'm just interested to see, like, you know, if they bring in, like, you know, Fred Curley or, you know, I'm not sure, you know, obviously there's like Christian Coleman. I was glad to see that they brought in Amin Yahu. I can't ever say his name. Yeah, Walla. Like, I really like him. And so I was so glad that they did like they brought him into that. Just like right off the bat, episode 1. I'm a big fan of his, and like Dina Asher Smith. So again, just names that, like, you know, because you've seen these athletes compete on these global stages, but you don't like know. So, and obviously we're familiar being on like the US side of things. But I'm curious to see like how much they actually like bring in these other athletes, or if it's going to be like more US dominant and kind of telling the stories of like the global superstars that like we know. I'm curious to see like how much they're going to do that. Yeah, so it's just, I read some things online that some people were like, this feels very US heavy, and it's almost like pitting the US against Jamaica and kind of like not like almost discrediting a little bit of like the Jamaican history and the sprints and just like the foundation that they've like set that kind of like catapulted sprints into like kind of helped like transcend sprints out of just like track and field and kind of helped make some of these athletes more like global superstars. So again, I'm just interested to see how they're going to like how these storylines are going to unfold and how they're going to kind of like what lens they're going to kind of focus on or tell some of these things through. But so far in episode 1, I felt like they kind of initially everyone that you kind of expected to be there was there.
Yeah, I know to that point as well for like how US centric this may feel or how global. I know it's showing up on, US Netflix. I haven't really looked into whether or not this is being like.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering too, Drew, because I was like, it feels like this is like, it is going to be obviously more US heavy because of where it's streaming. But I was like, I wonder what that looks like, like globally, like if that's going to have like a little bit of a different look. Like I didn't know, but I was like, I mean, I kind of expected it to be like that. I kind of assumed that's what it was going to be. But it was, it was interesting. Some people were saying that, just like on the Jamaica side of things, they were kind of like, well, this is painting just like one side of the picture, right? And you're like, well, we love to do that.
Yeah, during the credits, it did say this is made in conjunction with World Athletics, and we knew that coming in, right? So like that is hopeful that this still remains global. But I know something we talked about in our discussion a few months ago, and also when I talked to a friend who's in the production space, Kellen Reck, who is also a guest on the podcast earlier, he was talking about a lot of times in these kinds of docuseries, right? You have an idea of the stories you want to tell, but you're capturing so much.
Yeah, so much.
You tend to shape the narrative that forms. So knowing what happened in real life, after the fact and after production ended and the editing starts, maybe that's where, this more US-centric side started. And maybe if things went differently in real time, where let's say if like Zarnell Hughes like broke a world record, right? Mm-hmm. Great Britain athlete. Or if let's say we had like, maybe if it was somebody outside of the people we've met so far, right? Let's say like Johan Blake from.
Yeah, right.
Like let's say Johan Blake.
That was the name that I felt like was missing. But like, again, I'm like, maybe we just haven't gotten there yet. But yeah, well, like the big Jamaican men, you're like, where are they in this?
Yeah. And with that, maybe if like there was a record broken by somebody off this list, they would have retroactively had to like build that storyline in to support it. But I think the next thing I wanted to ask you about in the way that they're introducing personalities is, the personalities that we saw speaking about kind of setting the table again, introducing the scope of competition, who to watch, the significance of the event, or the, let's say like the intricacies of it, right? Our commentators, if you will, Allison Felix, Michael Johnson, Otto Bolt, and Usain Bolt.
Yeah.
These star-studded list of people.
I love that. I honestly, having Michael Johnson and Otto Bolton and Allison Felix kind of just like give like the commentary in between the stories that are being told is like so helpful as someone who again isn't familiar, like very familiar with how the sprint scene works and kind of, like what the dynamics are like and, just kind of what their big goals are and like all of that. Like it's nice to have people like that kind of like laying it out for you in between like the athlete cameos. I thought that was really cool. And it was like something that I like really enjoyed as just like a viewer. I was like, this is really helpful. And it helps kind of draw you in as well, like their expertise and them kind of talking on what they know. And it was great when they brought Bolton. I just love the sprinters because it just seems to be such a different mindset of just like, I'm the best. And like, what do you like, come get me? Like, what are you going to do about it? And like, Bolt was saying that basically about his record. He was just like, records are meant to be broken. But he has his work cut out for him, like you just like, it's just like they all have just like this confidence. And it just comes across so differently, I think. Again, given like the event that they're doing and like what it means to be great at the 100, I think it's just like, you just have different personalities that you don't necessarily see as much of on like the distance side of things, or you just see it in a different way. It's not to say that that's not there. But I've really enjoyed that. So when they brought Bolton, I'm like, bring him in more. I want him on this. So
really shows their personalities well.
Yeah.
Where you have Allison Felix, who is arguably one of the best known track athletes.
Most medals ever, right? Most track and field medals ever of like any athlete.
Right. And her name has transcended sport on like the women's side of the sport. And she speaks from an athlete perspective more so than like a commentator perspective. So it's great to have that legitimacy added and the name and her expertise on the track itself. Michael Johnson kind of splits the difference of like the commentator, athlete, and kind of like pundit, like internet pundit as well. As a former American record holder himself, right? Him speaking to the record that Noah Lyles broke was pretty cool. And he doesn't shy away from opinions at all.
No.
Whether online or apparently on a docuseries. And Usain Bolt has that same kind of vibe, right? Where he like you said, is a sharp critic, is the best of the best, and is there to kind of challenge people to say, if you want it, like, you're taking it from me, and good luck. Like
like if you want to be the best in the world, that's great, but like, come get it. Like, it's not just this thing that you can just go out and do. Like, you're gonna have to prove yourself,
Yeah.
And then you have people like Noah Lyles being like, essentially like, I was born to get this record. He's like, I'm gonna get it, and you're like, wow. Okay.
Yeah. And then with Otto Bolden, I think a fun thing there is like, when I think of watching the clips of things on YouTube, right, like races in the Diamond League or so like the U.S. competitions, I recognize his voice. So there's like the callback and a name and face to the color commentary you see in like NBC, which also, like, if you're watching the Olympics this summer, NBC has the contract, so you'll hear his voice again, which is cool. I wonder if building these stars for commentary will affect personalities that we hear and see during the Olympics, if there's some kind of concerted effort, or even in the Diamond League going forward, if we see more, Allison Felix or Usain Bolt or Michael Johnson being more of a fixture of like a voice off the track.
I love that. I think like athletes can, like, having athletes commentate, I think can really bring people into what they're watching in a very different way, because again, they're speaking to the expertise, they're speaking to understanding that event, having raced it time and time again themselves. And I just think it like really, even like being in the sport, it's really like, I really always enjoy listening to like Kara, commentate on like the women's event, like, or like on the distance events. And then like having Otto and Sonia Richards-Ross like talking about the sprints. And I just think like having athletes speak on that, I think Allison Felix would be great. Because again, it just kind of like it kind of helps get you into the mindset of the athletes you're watching, and it helps you understand the event that you're watching. And and they do a great job of highlighting those storylines to kind of, again, pull people in and kind of really, it gets people like rooting for who they're watching, and you're not just watching like, random people running around the track. Suddenly you're like very invested and you almost feel like you know them. So I think it's a great way to pull people in. And so it's cool that they're doing this with the docuseries, because that's essentially the same thing. Like, that's what they're doing, is they're helping paint kind of an understanding for what it means to be a 100-meter sprinter, or what it means to run the 200. And then talking on the personalities that are like really making up the sport now. So I would love to see more of that. I think that would be great.
Yeah, I do not envy anyone who has to pick the personalities in terms of like commentators, right? Because there's the legacy side where, right, just like we were talking about, I recognize Otto Bolden's voice.
Yeah.
There's value that Otto provides, and Carrie or Kara, right? Like both of them when they're on the broadcast, like I recognize those voices and there's good continuity there. But for the heavy hitter of somebody like Usain Bolt in the room to lend an opinion to that, and maybe even some of like the newer people, like do you keep the revolving door open so that way you're always bringing in like the newish names who are good at commentary? It's challenging. I mean, something I've learned on TikTok recently through, which is, I'm not going to say I read articles anymore. I learned this on TikTok.
I'm so much cooler. You sound so much more like young and hip than me when you just said that. You're like, I learned this on TikTok. Man, I should get a TikTok.
Well, it is. I mean, it is a source of education sometimes. It takes a lot of sifting to seek the educational content. But one of the people that I see in the feed, Isaac Rochelle, right? He's been on the Raiders. He's been in the league been in the NFL for a long time. He is currently between contracts, and he has gone to broadcasting camp, something that the NFL offers to develop former athlete talent to become commentators in the sport. And it is a really, really narrow funnel, but it's taking the expertise and the mind of the athlete and shaping it to be best suited for like a media presence as a commentator. And obviously I know like track and field is miles away from being able to develop something like that, but I feel like that's such a cool concept of like, they're so invested in providing this pipeline of athletes into that space that it is really cool to see somebody show up on camera, but you kind of don't think about how much work it takes for them to be like good on camera, other than just a good athlete.
Yeah, I remember Kara Goucher was sharing that with me, how like she got the NBC job, because I was asking her, I was like, how did this come about? Like, how do you, like, again, like, you know, I always look at commentating or like, you know, the people that do like athlete interviews, and I'm like, that would be such a cool job. Like that would be such a cool thing to transition into. But then I'm like, how does one even do that? So she was telling me that she got like a phone call from NBC and they were looking to add in like a distance expertise, and they wanted to like interview her. And she said it was such an intensive like interview process, because they basically like brought up like an old like world championships, and then she had to know like every athlete in the field and then be able to speak on each athlete, because you just obviously don't know how the race is going to play out. So you have to be so well versed on like the history and background of everyone you're watching, and then like name pronunciation, and then, you know, you're doing like, but then like because of the timing and like commercial breaks, and she's always doing it with like Lee Diffie, who's like asking the questions, but then you only get so much space to actually talk about it before like it hands off back to him. And so she just said it was like, she got off of that and was like, yeah, like, I don't know if this is something that I can do, or if I even like did a good job or whatever. And then she was going through like just doing the world championships last year, and like how like intensive that 10 days is. And like, you just have to be so quick on your feet. You just have to have all that information like at the ready, and you have teams of people that are helping feed that to you. But again, I was like, man, I need a camp, or I need some type of like, you need like instruction almost, or like you said, you need kind of like a setup where like, you know, media personalities that are already kind of doing that can kind of help like bring you under their wing and kind of like teach you how to like take the knowledge you have as an athlete, but then how do you talk about that in a way that can like come across to people who like aren't in the sport, or who are just like tuning in. Like, how do you do that? But yeah, she was like, it was wild. And I was like, that sounds so hard. Like, I got like stressed out thinking about it.
Broadcast camp starts tomorrow, Laura.
Yeah, I was gonna say, we'll be on board.
Yep. So that just like the personality perspective, like we're talking about right now, I know we're spending this like a fair amount of time talking about it, but it's so important to create the storylines, like in addition to the storylines.
That's what brings people in. You have to have storylines. Otherwise it's like, well, you're not invested. So that's kind of like what they're building in this first episode. And you're like, oh yeah, okay, here we go.
Right. And the three things that they pushed out in like the first 5 minutes sizzle reel, right? At like all things you're going to see this season to some extent, right?
Well,
is they talk about 3 clear conflicts to me, and I want to hear if I missed any. One is team versus team. You mentioned this as well. They immediately established like the Shikari quote of like, it's USA versus Jamaica. And then they have like a clip that talks about like the athlete versus self of Zarnell Hughes false starting, and bringing shame upon his family name and country and all this stuff. And then also obviously like the competition, the athlete versus athlete itself, talking about 14 races around the world, referring to the Diamond League circuit that goes on, year over year. And they talk about the pinnacle, right? The pinnacle of the entire competition that they're going to work towards and they're going to bring you into as like the conclusion of this whole thing is Budapest World Champions in 2023. And just talking about how that's the best in the world. It's the event to watch in 2023 with an eye towards the Olympics. So they really set the stage in that way. Am I missing anything in that sizzle reel that you were talking about? Obviously, there's the episode versus episode, London Diamond League versus Paris Diamond League. That's obviously baked in. But anything else in that sizzle reel that I might have missed?
No, I think those are the big storylines that you can kind of take away from, like as they like intro you into like what you're about to watch. Like the whole, I feel like they're gonna paint all of these different kind of battles that lead to Budapest, and they shape that in the first episode, right? Like they like the first stop on the way to Budapest is Paris, and they're kind of shaping that, and they're really focused on the men's 100 and just like the storylines within that event, and kind of like they're kind of already like building that rivalry, or kind of like already kind of building like who are you gonna like, what team are you gonna be on, like who are you cheering for, and they kind of like really bring you into that. So I think that's the big one, is just obviously that's what we're building towards, and they're going to show us what it looks like to get there and how you prep for that. Because I think that's what's cool about this, is because so many people tune in to the Olympics every 4 years, or like tune into World Championships, and then like that's track and field to them. And so I think what's cool about this is it's really opening up like, no, track and field is like basically year round. And there's all of these different steps, just like in any other sport. It's like football. Like you don't like, maybe you just watch the Super Bowl every year, but you're like aware that like to get to the Super Bowl, there's an entire season that unfolds, and there's all of these different storylines and things that happen to get the two teams that are ultimately end up there. So that's what this is doing, is it's like bringing people into like, this is how these athletes get to the Olympics or the World Championships that you tune into every year or every 4 years. This is kind of what it looks like to be a track and field athlete. And these are all the things they have to do before they can even get there. So I love that that's kind of what they're going to paint, because I think so many people outside of the sport aren't really aware of like what it looks like to actually be a professional athlete, because they're like, oh, well, you have the Olympics, but then like, what do you do between Olympics? Like what do you do for 4 years? And you're just like, this is what it means to be a professional track and field athlete. Because so many people are like, oh, you can run for a living. Like I literally had no idea. I thought it was just like the Olympics. And you're like, no, it's like everything else. So I think that's what's cool about this, is it's like bringing people into like what it actually means to do that.
Cool. So I know you were talking, Laura, about how we are setting up the scope of this pinnacle, right? All of these things is a year-round competition. And I know there's going to be like some Reddit boys in the chat for sure that are like, oh, it's much more complicated than that. What about like, different competition that doesn't fit within the scope of like the Diamond League, right? Because that's
right.
going to be our arc through the year of competition to get to World Championships. But I admire the simplification for most of people watching this, because it's so much easier to think of this thing as like, hey, this is the stage in which like the international competition takes place. It might not be where the fastest times are always run, and it may not include Olympic selection, which is different for different countries, and very frustrating to try to keep up with, and super confusing, right?
Oh, because we still don't know who we're sending for like 3 events. It's so confusing. So I feel like you have to simplify that. Again, like this is a jumping off point, right? Like the hope is that it's going to be like Unchained and Breakpoint and like other sports documentaries where it's like they come out with a season and then they build off of that. So, but this is the first like set of episodes to kind of like really build like what track and field is and like what it means to be a professional track and field athlete, and bring people into that. And so I think you have to simplify it enough so people can follow and kind of get invested. And then once you build that base, then you start to grow and kind of like, you know, maybe get into like more of the nitty gritty things and like expand hopefully to other event areas and things like that. But I don't think you can just start with all of that. Like, yeah, you and I are both in the sport. And after the trials, I was like, I don't even know. I'm confused on who's ranked where and who's pulling out and who's going to boost rankings and how you double points. And it was confusing. So you can't just like throw that at people and be like, oh, do you get it? People would be like, ugh, whoa, too much.
Maybe the hurdle they'll have to get over later on in the series is, you know, in order to get to Worlds, right, there is a qualification process for that. Yes. So it's not quite as confusing as like Olympic selection, but they will have to talk about that. Yes. Because it isn't just like how you did in the Diamond League to get to World Champs. So I'm sure that'll be a point of education where they'll use their personalities to kind of describe that a little bit more. But for the most part, like the framework checks out, you know, like you said, year round, like we can understand it's a relatively global tour and they're going to highlight specific races or rivalries or storylines in each one of these things, similar to in Unchained when they're talking about different stages of the Tour de France. There's only 8 episodes, but there's like 21 stages. So of course we'll kind of skip around a little bit and you might not hear everything, but it still helps kind of move the progression of events forward.
Right. And you understanding as a viewer, like that event and what you're watching. If you're someone that's like already in the sports, like that's kind of the goal here, I think, with this.
Yeah. I think something that was really cool with them starting off with Paris Diamond League is like the two things that they discuss, right? Is they kind of do a little bit more explanation about Diamond League by introducing Paris as the first stop of this. And then they get into like the Noah versus Marcel conflict, which obviously like we'll get into, and before they actually have the race going itself, because we've talked about this before. This is a fewer than 10 seconds of competition,
right?
It actually takes place. There's a lot of drum rolls and crescendos until
that is wild to me too, as being like a distance runner. I'm like, you're flying all over the world and you're running for 9 seconds and like that's it, and you're just like, it's wild. It's so cool. Yeah. And I think Noah was saying how like that, like, because it's only 9 seconds of running, like there's so many things that can actually go wrong in the 100, and like everything almost has to go like perfectly because you don't have any time to make up an error. And so just speaking on, it's a short, quick event, but like there's so many, but because of that, there's so many, like you have to execute everything. There's no room for error, especially on those global stages when like everyone is kind of like the best of the best. So
yeah. I think what you're talking about definitely also lends to the educational aspect of how they set things up in the beginning, right? When they introduce this, and it's cool that they're talking about Paris being a Diamond League stop as we look forward to the Olympics in Paris. And they also talk about like, this is the way you prep for global competition, but they also talk about some things that we might not consider in this. There's the conflicts of like fighting for a lane through qualification. There's fighting for sponsors because everyone here is the top, 1% of the sport, and they're all fighting for the same dollars, usually from the biggest footwear brands in the world. And they're also fighting for medals and fighting for prize money. I mean, the thing that I was surprised by, and I want to hear your take on this, is Gabby Thomas, and in talking about this, actually says, she's like, yeah, you're fighting for 10K.
Yeah.
Actually saying what they get prize money wise is wild. I didn't expect to hear that today.
Yeah, I thought that was really cool. She put a number to it because, again, I feel like there's really not a lot of transparency in the sport. And so people often don't know what other people are making. People don't often, because of that, always know what their value is, what their competitors are bringing in versus like what they're actually getting. We don't ever put like dollar amounts to like how a lot of this works. So when she was like, yeah, we're out here fighting for 10K, and you're like, yeah, like, I mean, we need to speak more on that. I think it would like having more, like, I understand there's balance to that, you know, like, you don't, you know, I get not everyone wants to just like be blatantly like sharing like this is exactly what I'm making, or this is how everything is structured. But it's just like, I think if there was more transparency and we weren't afraid to just like name the number and like really be honest about what we're all out here trying, like what we're all out here fighting for, which is basically our livelihood. Like what that looks like, I think would like really only help athletes in negotiating and like getting what they're actually worth. And like not keeping all of that so secretive in the sport, and kind of it, I think that does a disservice to athletes. So I love that she was like, this is what we're all fighting for. And then she spoke on like, it's such a, and like Allison Felix spoke on this too, about how like it's such a weird dynamic because you're all like, you're in this hotel with like all of your competitors that are all like, you're all going for the, you know, you're all fighting for brand sponsorship. You're all fighting for like the 10K prize purse. You know, you're all fighting for lane assignments. And you see each other like over and over and over again on the circuit because it's such an elite group of people at this level. And so it's like you're kind of making friendships with these people, but then at the same time, you're like, well, yeah, like it'd be cool to be friends, but also like I want to kill you when I get out there, and like I want to be the best. And like we're fighting for such a small piece of the pie. Like again, that's also what's crazy to me is it's like, yeah, 10K is like a lot, but like it also like isn't. And so it's just like, again, like you have some of the best athletes in the world all scrapping for, you know, like whatever the prize purse is. And it just creates such an interesting dynamic between the athletes. And I love that they spoke on that, and they were, because I mean, as an athlete myself going to races, like it's very similar, like going to like a major marathon, like, you know, you compete against these women over and over and over. And like, you know, a lot of them you've been in the sport with for 10 or more years. So it's like you do have these relationships and friendships, but you're also all out there just like battling to the death to get like every ounce of sponsorship or every dollar. And like, you know, and so it is such a weird dynamic, and there's tension in that, and you're all just cooped up like waiting for your chance to get out there and just like go to war with one another. So I love that they spoke on that, and you're like, oh, it's like the same. Doesn't matter what event you're doing, like we all feel that. Like I kind of got like nervous even when they were like counting down to the race at Paris, and they're in the hotel like all like eating in like, you know, that big conference room, and I'm like, oh my god, like the anxiety that I always feel when you're like, you know, it's almost race time and you're all just in there kind of just like nerves. And yeah, you're just like, we're all here to do one thing, which is to win. But only one person can do that.
Right. And I think of Full Swing, like that.
Yeah.
Produced by the same production house. Money was a big storyline in that particular one because, I mean, I had no idea. I knew there was money in golf.
Right.
That right? When like truly when somebody would sink that putt to win, there would be like a number on the screen. It would be like $2.1 million Ryder Cup. But you know, and you're like, what? Yeah.
Like, oh, that's resting on like one putt. You're like, holy, like that gives you perspective of like the pressure, right? That like athletes carry, like that big piece of sports that we don't, you know, as fans always understand.
And I imagine, right, that money became a big fixture of that narrative for golf because it was a fixture with why people were leaving one league and going to another, why they were turning their back on the PGA to play in the LIB.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So like it makes sense there. I'm wondering, like, you know, not to fast forward too much, but we don't see like that those dollars flash on the screen the same way for this. And you could argue because it might be a bad look for us to like be celebrating, you know, a prize purse that is a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of what the Ryder Cup is, even though it's apples and oranges. But I wonder, since World Athletics is kind of in the mix for production and sign off, that maybe that's not what they're comfortable showcasing. But I wanted to provide a little bit more context around like the stakes at everything before we get into, you know, the specifics. So the Diamond League functions off of, right, the prize money aspect that we just talked about, that goes on at each individual meeting, but then also at a final. And then there's also qualification points that are earned at each one. So essentially the more you race and the better you do, right, it's going to benefit you. But it does come at the expenses of traveling the world and doing that. So it is really tough. So they award these qualification points towards the final, the Diamond League final that takes place at the end of the rotation, by awarding 8 points for first place all the way down to 1 point for eighth place in that descending order. And then the prize money every single meeting. So when you watch Paris, when you watch London, when you watch Eugene, all of those individuals, first place is paid out $10,000, like Gabby Thomas said, all the way down to $5,000 in eighth. So it's kind of descending through there. And then the final additional at the end of this is if you come in first place at the final, it's $30,000, and then all the way down to $1,000 in eighth place. So if you're cleaning up across 14 events, you are making $140,000 on the Diamond League if you're getting first place every single time. And that's not a retainer. That's not what your sponsor's paying you, because there are additional bonuses that triggered if you're placing first or even placing eighth in a Diamond League. So it is complex. And maybe that's another reason why they want to avoid kind of putting like points and dollars and numbers and figures on things instead of just focusing on fast as fast.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing, because that's always like, the argument with running is it's like, it's such a simple sport and it's you against the clock. And then you bring in all of these other things and it slowly starts to feel like what once was really simple and what is really simple can get so complicated by like the different systems and structures we have set up so people can make a living doing this. Yeah. But I would like to see that at some point be talked about, like even just the way that you did it. Like just giving people that broader sense of like, this is how it works. Mm-hmm. This is how athletes earn money. And this is how the point system, like these are the incentives. And this is, because again, so many people always ask me like, how do you make money running? Like, okay, like you have a shoe sponsorship, but like, is that it? And you're like, well, no, like there's prize money, there's point systems, like there's bonuses. And, I mean, it is really complicated. And so I think bringing people into just a simplified version of that, like gives that understanding of like, oh, I understand a little bit more of what I'm watching. Right. And I can almost be invested a little bit more in some of these storylines, knowing what these athletes are fighting for and what's on the line outside of just like records. And what does it mean to get a world record? Like that's always a huge bonus, right? Like these athletes are making, you can make 100,000 if you get a world record, depending on like bonuses and things like that. So it's just, I think it just adds to the storylines, because you're like, okay, I get why it's so cutthroat and like why these athletes, like, another quote that I loved, and I think it was Noah, I can't remember, maybe it was Marcel, but they were saying like the 100 guys aren't chummy because everyone wants to be at the top and everyone wants to be number one because all of these things are on the line for that. And I think Michael Johnson was like, sprinters want to be eternal. Right. And how do you do that? You win Olympic gold, right? Like that's what, so you have that obviously and then all this other stuff. So it just paints the picture. And I think kind of brings you into that world and you're like, oh, I get it now. Yeah.
What even if you think about like the final is the pinnacle of each one of these episodes, right? Like we're watching the last thing, the last round of this. So you're seeing 8 people on the line. That means every single person online will receive some form of financial compensation. Mm-hmm. But maybe in the same parallel to Full Swing, like we talked about, where they talk about like the idea of the cut. You have to perform well enough in order to be able to move on. And you might go to that event and make nothing if you don't perform. I think that's something that could also help kind of paint the picture like you were saying. If you saw, let's say, one of these big characters, and maybe even somebody who's not a big character, that if they're not making the final, they flew all the way there or they got there and they left with a goose egg. Whereas, I mean, there still is drama in the last place finisher in the final, for example, is making $500. Yeah. Each person who crossed the line in first, 10 grand. Yeah. Massive disparity. Even though they're all getting a check. Like Marcel Jacobs, right? When he finishes the race, in addition he does, that it is a very disparate difference, but I don't want to give too much away. I don't think we need to worry about spoilers of this, but it's in the interest of time and things, right? Like I know they paint this rivalry between Noah moving into the 100 for the first time on a Diamond League circuit versus Marcel, the former Olympic champion. And they kind of paint their styles against each other, almost like boxers in a way.
Yes,
which is
100%, which is really cool because, like, why do people love boxing so much? Like, outside of just, like, you know, the athletic piece of it, but it's just like the personalities and, like, you're painting rivalries, like, and you're giving people completely different people to root for, and, like, you know, like, that is so important. And I feel like that's kind of what we've been lacking in track and field is, like, these big personalities. I'm not saying that you have to have that, but, like, again, like, painting these rivalries of, like, you know, that's what brings people in. And so I love that right off the bat. With, like, the men's side of things, they're like kind of doing that, because I think that is such an important piece of, like, building fans in sport is, like, you have to have rivalries, like, you have to have that. Otherwise, you know, like, you're not going to pay as close attention to it.
Yeah. And when they talk about Marcel being the former Olympic champion, they bring in these kind of doubts that are surrounding him because leading into that race, he had dropped out at a few different races.
Yeah, he hasn't done, like, hardly anything, it sounds like, since the Olympics 3 years ago. So now there's all these whispers, and it's like when he's healthy and he shows up in form, he's obviously one of the fastest men on the planet, and, like, rightfully earned that Olympic gold. But now there's all this doubt swirling around him because he's been pulling out of so many things. It sounds like he's been really injured and just, like, hasn't been able to stay healthy. And then his wife was talking about just the pressures that come with having done what he did at the Olympics, and how it changed his life, but not always necessarily for the best. Like, just that's just so much to handle. And I think Otto said that the best. He was just like, the Olympic gold is a heavy crown. And that's, like, a really hard thing to, like, balance. So they're painting him as kind of almost like he's the Olympic champion, but in a way it was, like, almost like he's, like, the underdog.
Yeah.
Like, now, so, like, yeah. And then you have Noah Lyles stepping down. What did he say? The 200 is his wife, but the 100 is his mistress.
Right. Well,
and they're painting that whole story about, like, he's trying to challenge himself with the 100, because, again, he even said it, like, the 100 is where it's, like, that's, like, you know, kind of what he felt like was, you know, the cream of the crop, so to speak, as far as, like, winning the 100, like, what that would mean. Yeah. So he's stepping down, and then so again, like, I just loved the storylines, but it was just interesting, kind of, like, you see the contrast between the two.
I even love the specificity of them talking about Marcel's ability lies in his start, and Noah is the opposite. And they're talking about, even they bring in talking about Usain Bolt, and Usain was not a good starter.
I don't think I ever realized that watching him, because it's just like, I don't know, like, you can kind of tell who had a really good start and who didn't, but, like, but my eye's not trained for that. And then they're showing all these clips focusing on his start, and you're like, oh my God, like, how is he doing what he was doing? Like, he was just that good. Or he could be, like, last out of the blocks and then still finish, like, 5 meters ahead of everyone.
Yeah.
But then, they're like, I mean, it's cool that they're getting specific with it, because you're like, oh, like, now I can, like, really see what I'm, like, I can really, like, understand what I'm seeing, basically.
Yeah, and it's cool to see how they're getting granular and educating you as a viewer, and educating me as a viewer, to make me actually care about the minutia of what we're seeing. And it's not just like, oh, that guy had a bad day, that guy had a good day. And that there is skill and there is ability to overcome. I know Noah's coach was like, you don't teach them how to run fast, you teach them how to run fast better.
Yeah.
Even that is something that I think is important, because I was a little worried about, like, how they're going to craft skill versus luck as a component of this whole thing. And I think they're off to a really good start, in addition to building out the storylines around who they are, for sure.
But they're building out the event that you're watching.
Right.
And they're trying to, like, shed light on, like, what makes this event what it is. And so then as they're building storylines and they're kind of highlighting different skill sets and kind of who brings what, you can just appreciate it differently. So I love that they've done that. For again, I'm in the sport, but I'm not a sprinter. So I feel like I'm learning how to watch sprints differently in a way that like I can appreciate it differently, because I'm like, okay, like I get it and I understand the specifics of it a little bit better, which is really cool. So yeah, that's been really fun for me so far. I'm like, oh, I get it now. I get it even more.
So as we wrap this up, I guess one question I want to ask you is, with this first episode under your belt as a viewer, what's something like last comment on something that you're either cautious around, or like we want to see more of this, we want to see less of this, or something that you're like a little skeptical around? We can both share our thing before we wrap up.
That's a good question. Yeah, I don't actually know. I don't know if I have an answer to that.
Well, you sprinkled your tidbits like through this whole episode of like the things that you're enjoying about like the education component, and like you gave a lot of positive encouragement for this, for sure.
Yeah. No, I mean, again, I think it'll be interesting to see who they continue to highlight, and the athletes that they really focus on and talk about, and kind of how that dynamic is kind of played out. I guess that'll be interesting to see. And then, like I said, I've only watched the first episode, so I'm excited to, which was all focused on like the men. So I'm excited to see how they like highlight the women, and how they like kind of bring them into all of this. Yeah.
Well, I couldn't agree more with your positive encouragement and the excitement for what's to come. I'd say that, relating back to a comment that you had, my last and final thought here is just like a little bit of skepticism from episode to episode, because this does seem like they are building these narratives around the two U.S. standouts, right? Noah and Sha'Carri. And as they're doing that, we saw a great display of Noah's good at this, but not good at this. Marcel is the opposite. If every time they come back to the men's race and it's like Noah is good at this and not good at this, and the person is the opposite, right? How many different ways can you bring up an opponent and make them feel like a threat each time? Because if you don't have that element of the legitimate competitor, and it doesn't feel authentic or it doesn't feel new-ish each time, then you have to ride the wave that the person that they're betting on, let's say like a Noah or Sha'Carri, that they are strong enough of an individual, episode over episode over episode, that they don't even need a counterpart, and that it's just them against them. So I'm a little like skeptical. I'm cautiously optimistic, knowing how they have built storylines in the past, but I think that's something that could get a little stale to us pretty quickly.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think that's a good way to put kind of what I was trying to say. It'll be interesting to see how they continue to kind of build that out, because it already kind of feels like we know what the focus is going to be, and that's kind of what I think, that's how it feels to me. So I'm like, it'll be interesting to see how they like continue to bring other people into this, how they paint that and like what that looks like.
Thank you again for tuning into our first episode, companion to Netflix's Sprint. We just covered that episode 1, Heir to the Throne, and we look forward to a weekly series where we dive into the next episode and the next episode and the next episode. So stay tuned. There's a lot more things on the way, and we'd love to have that perspective from Laura again. So again, big thanks to Laura and the perspective she brings to things, but we want to encourage everyone to make their thoughts known, right? Don't operate in a vacuum. Please comment on this, leave reviews, just contact us in whatever way you'd like, just to provide perspective, and we'd love to consider it. We'd love to bring it up and really credit the viewers with the opinion on what is going to make this greater. So stay tuned. Thank you again, and we'll see you soon.